I'd like to call this hearing to order. Today we're going to look at the regulatory roadblocks to the nation's manufacturing renaissance with a discussion draft of a bill entitled the Promoting New Manufacturing Act. And I do want to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. We look forward to your testimony, and certainly I will be introducing each one of you, and we'll have questions for you a little bit later. At this time, I would like to recognize myself for a 5-minute opening statement. Polls have shown that the American people are of the opinion that economic growth and job creation is the #1 issue facing the American people. And I think all of us recognize that the very slow economic growth over the last 6 years has been pretty frustrating for all of us. Now, I know that President Obama and Vice President Biden and people in his administration talk about this issue frequently as well. As a matter of fact, the President frequently in public talks about the importance of streamlining the permitting process. And yet, as is so often the case, he frequently says one thing, but then his administration takes actions that are contrary to that. And that has certainly been happening at EPA and many of the other regulatory bodies. Now, the chemical industry estimated as of this week that 177 projects, manufacturing projects, have been proposed in the U.S. representing $112 billion in investment in over 600,000 high-paying manufacturing jobs. This is an extremely positive development, obviously, and also with the great renaissance that we're having in the natural gas arena, we have a unique opportunity in America to step out in front and be one of the leading competitors in the world and competing in the world to grow this economy and create jobs. But this manufacturing renaissance is far from a done deal, especially given the cumbersome permitting process that these projects must go through. It would be a great disservice to the American people if our nation's natural gas advantage is squandered through an unnecessarily lengthy, bureaucratic process that delays or even prevents these job-creating modern new facilities from being built. Now, I might add that we invited EPA to testify today, but the agency declined our invitation to permit. They did talk to us yesterday and said they look forward to working with us on a technical basis as we explore this legislation. And obviously, we welcome that. That's very important. And even though EPA won't be here today, we do have other witnesses who agree with EPA's position, and I'm sure that they will do a great job of explaining precisely the views of their entities as well as probably the way EPA feels about some of these issues. I believe this bill contains several common sense measures to increase transparency and reduce unnecessary permitting delays. It increases the amount of public information about the number of these permits being issued, how long the process is taking, and also requires more information on EPA's Environmental Appeals Board process. It reduces permitting delays by requiring that the implementing regulations and guidance be finalized concurrently with any new or revised national ambient air quality standard rather than doing it either months or even years later. And it also directs EPA to report to Congress on steps being taken by the agency to expedite the permitting process. I might add that none of the substantive requirements under the Clean Air Act would be altered in any way under this bill. In fact, these new industrial facilities will be considerably cleaner, more efficient than those currently in operation in the U.S. as well as those operating overseas. So in sum, the discussion draft includes reasonable steps to streamline the permitting process something that the administration agrees, at least the President says, needs to be addressed. So we're open to all suggestions to improve this vehicle as we move forward. And I look forward to the hearing. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Chicago, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Promoting New Manufacturing Act is billed as legislation that will require greater transparency and timeliness in obtaining pre-construction permits for new manufacturing facilities as required under the Clean Air Act. Mr. Chairman, while I am not opposed to the idea of expediting the permitting process in a practical and thoughtful way, I'm not convinced that the bill before us today, as currently drafted, is the way to go about in terms of reforming this process. One of the main concerns I have, Mr. Chairman, with this legislation is that it puts an additional burden and additional responsibility on the U.S. EPA at a time when Congress has been steadily slashing funding for the EPA, making it much more difficult, if not impossible, for it to carry out all of its duties, these new duties, even some of the old duties, the new duties that, of course, that this bill today requires. Additionally, this bill today before us appears to exempt new facilities from complying with the revised National Ambient Air Quality Standards if specific unrealistic conditions are not met, without taking into consideration the fact that much of the guidance, much of the implementation regulations are enacted on the state level. Specifically, Mr. Chairman, Section 3 adds a new requirement for the EPA that when publishing any final, new, or revised National Ambient Air Quality Standard, it must also concurrently, and I quote, publish implementing regulations and guidance. However, Mr. Chairman, in many cases, state and regulated entities already have the tools and the guidance necessary for implementing the new National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and in other cases, this guidance evolves organically as issues and questions appear. I fear the consequence of this provision in Section 3, either intentionally or unintentionally, is that it may lead to an emergence of new lawsuits by industry claiming that the EPA failed to meet this new requirement of concurrently issuing all final regulations and guidance when publishing the revised NAAQS, which may subsequently lead to detrimental delays in the issuance of new protective air quality standards. I also have concerns with the provision stating that a new or revised NAAQS shall not apply to the review and the disposition of a pre-construction permit application unless final regulations and guidance concerning the submittal and consideration of permit applications have already been published. If a new facility is allowed to be built in in an attainment area, but it does not have to comply with new or revised national ambient air quality standards. It is unclear how that new facility will impact existing facilities they may want to expand, and in fact, it may push the entire area into a non-attainment area under this legislation, Mr. Chairman. Additionally, in areas of non-attainment, allowing new facilities to be constructed that do not have to meet revised national ambient air quality standards may force other existing facilities to make even deeper cuts in their pollution emissions in order to bring the area into attainment. Finally, Mr. Chairman, while I look forward to engaging the distinguished panelists before us here today, I think it would serve the members of this subcommittee well. It will serve all interested parties well to hear from and to question the EPA directly on how this legislation would affect the permitting processes. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we will have the opportunity to do so before we move this bill to markup, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. Mr. Upton is not here this morning. Mr. Shimkus, do you or Mr. Latta have any comments? Okay. Okay. This time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't expecting to get up this early. I think for today's hearing focuses on the discussion draft of Promoting New Manufacturing Act, and I thank the witnesses for coming here this morning to taking time to testify about the proposed legislation. I hope that we will have an opportunity to hear from the EPA before we go to marking up this bill as well. I strongly support promoting new manufacturing in the United States, and in fact, I spent a decade in the manufacturing sector, so I sympathize. However, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, Mr. Chairman, the bill looks like an attempt to weaken the Clean Air Act, so we need some work on this provision. Under the current law, the EPA sets national ambient air quality standards at levels sufficient to protect public health and with an adequate margin of safety. Essentially, these standards identify the level of air pollution that is safe to breathe. When a company wants to build a new large facility or expand an existing one, it has to apply for a pre-construction permit. States, not the EPA, issue most of these permits. To get a permit, a company must commit to install appropriate pollution controls and show that the emissions from the new expanded facility will not cause a violation of the air quality standards. That's a straightforward standard. We shouldn't allow new facilities to worsen already dirty air or make clean air unsafe to breathe. Periodically, the EPA updates the air quality standards when the scientific evidence shows that is necessary to protect public health. Under the Clean Air Act, new facilities need to meet whatever air quality standard is in place, and that ensures that the air is healthy to breathe. But this bill says that the EPA must issue regulations and guidance for implementing a new air quality standard at the same time that it issues the standard. If the EPA doesn't do this, then to get a permit, new facilities only have to show that they meet the old, less protective standard. I represented a part of California's San Joaquin Valley, which has some of the nation's worst air pollution. These conditions negatively affect the quality of life, including health, safety, and missed days of school and work. In other words, it addresses air quality isn't just a public health issue, but it's an economic issue. In the Valley, pollution control, the Pollution Control District has up to 180 days to make a determination, but often these cases are permitted in just a few hours. Our region has been successful in addressing pre-construction permitting. However, the bill introduces uncertainty into the permitting process, requiring the EPA to issue regulations and guidance, but it's not clear what regulations and guidance will be sufficient. Also, when a facility gets a permit under the old standard, it's unclear whether it would be grandfathered in permanently or whether it would have to go back later and install additional pollution controls. Adding uncertainty will delay the permitting process. The bill also imposes a host of new reporting requirements about permitting times, which impacts the states, since the states and not the EPA actually issues almost all of these permits. This reporting burden will be carried by the same state and EPA personnel who process the permits. The bill adds to their workload and authorizes no new funding. People in my district and the Valley deserve clean air, and the Valley has made substantial progress in addressing this goal. In fact, this year is the cleanest air on record. We should continue to build on those efforts, not increase the burdens on air pollution controlled districts. We should be discussing how we can deliver more funding and resources for those agencies rather than weakening public health protections. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNerney. And once again, I want to thank the 6 witnesses for being with us this morning. All of you are quite knowledgeable, and we look forward to your testimony. Instead of introducing each one of you and then going back and introduce you again, I'm just going to introduce you one by one as I recognize you for your 5 minutes. So our first witness this morning is Ms. Lorraine Gershman, who is the Director of Regulatory and Technical Affairs at the American Chemistry Council. And Ms. Gershman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Chemistry Council in support of the draft legislation promoting New Manufacturing Act. This legislation will improve the regulatory permitting process for new and expanded factories and help ensure continued growth in shale-related manufacturing in the United States. ACC represents the leading companies engaged in the business of chemistry. We apply the science of chemistry to create innovative products and services that help make people's lives better, healthier, and safer. The U.S. chemical industry is a key element of the economy, providing 784,000 skilled, good-paying jobs all across our country. We are among the nation's largest exporters and investors in R&D. Our advanced materials and technologies include many that help save energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. High-performance building insulation and windows, solar panels and wind turbines, and lightweight packaging and vehicle parts all start with chemistry. America's chemical industry is undergoing a historic expansion made possible by abundant, affordable supplies of natural gas and natural gas liquids from shale formations. Due to our decisive competitive advantage in the cost and availability of energy and feedstock, the United States is currently the most attractive place in the world to invest in chemical manufacturing. As of this week, 177 chemical industry projects valued at $112 billion in potential new U.S. investment have been announced. Fully 62% of this is foreign direct investment. Within 10 years, the new investments could generate tens of billions of dollars in new chemical industry exports and hundreds of thousands of permanent new jobs. All of these projects must undergo a lengthy and complex environmental permitting process filled with challenges that could derail the investments. Problems include uncertainty as to the schedule and process for obtaining a final pre-construction permit and a requirement that companies use emission modeling programs that cannot adequately accommodate site-specific data. Once a project is significantly delayed, the project can be scrapped and companies make plans to proceed elsewhere. During his State of the Union address this past January, President Obama highlighted the important role that domestic natural gas is playing in the U.S. economy and committed his administration to facilitate the permitting process for manufacturing projects. The President said, businesses plan to invest over $100 billion in new factories that use natural gas. I'll cut red tape to help those states get these factories built. The White House fact sheet stated the administration will help states and localities coordinate review of proposed private sector projects to invest in new energy-intensive U.S. manufacturing plants relying on natural gas. Manufacturing facilities must be able to obtain required permits in a timely, transparent, and efficient manner. In recent years, EPA has tightened a number of NAAQS, including ozone in 2008, nitrogen dioxide and sulfur oxides in 2010, and fine particulate matter in 2012. A proposed tighter ozone NAAQS is expected later this year. Meanwhile, EPA is still working to implement these standards, along with some even older NAAQS. Lacking clear direction from EPA, state permitting agencies and manufacturing facilities have, at times, been left confused about the requirements to complete the pre-construction permitting process. Manufacturing facilities need certainty and transparency in the permitting process. The steps required to obtain a pre-construction air permit within the Clean Air Act's required 12-month deadline must be clear to all. EPA must issue implementation rules and guidance in tandem with any final NAAQS rules. The Promoting New Manufacturing Act will improve the permitting process by creating a dashboard showing the total number of pre-construction permits issued during the fiscal year, the percentage issued within 1 year of application, and the average length of the review process, requiring EPA to issue guidance concurrent with any new rules so the manufacturers fully understand how to comply, and directing EPA to prepare an annual report to Congress on actions the agency has taken to expedite the permitting process. The Promoting New Manufacturing Act represents a step towards a timely, efficient, and transparent regulatory process. We are hopeful that with continued leadership from this committee and others in the House, that we can pass this bill and expedite the unprecedented chemical industry investment planned for the United States. With that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gershman. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Ken Weiss, who is the Global Managing Partner for the Air and Climate Change Environmental Resource Management Company, and you're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Weiss.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of the draft legislation promoting New Manufacturing Act. The legislation will remove much uncertainty and related schedule delays from the air emissions permitting process for major capital projects and help ensure continued growth in manufacturing in the United States. ERM is a leading global provider of environmental health, safety, and risk and sustainability-related services. We have more than 5,000 people operating in 40 countries and in about 150 offices around the world. 70 of those offices are in the United States. We have about 350 air quality staff in the United States. We've worked for about 50% of the global Fortune 500 in the past 5 years on air quality-related assignments, and each year we do about 800 air quality-related assignments. Most of our work is in the oil and gas, power, mining, chemicals, and manufacturing sectors across a wide swath of American industry, and a significant portion of my practice is advising these industries and my clients on the impacts of air permitting regulations on major capital projects. My experience almost unanimously is that air pre-construction permits are typically on the critical path of the vast majority of major capital projects, and that about 900 projects a year might require these types of permits that would be facilitated by the Promoting New Manufacturing Act. Companies seeking to execute capital projects need to be able to develop realistic and predictable project timelines. This would ensure that equipment can be designed, procured, installed, and brought online when expected, and also support investment decisions. The uncertainty in the permitting process creates significant issues for such investment decisions. Companies are forced to guess at the amount of additional time to build into the permitting cycle for planning, as EPA often fails to meet the 1-year time limit allowed in the Clean Air Act for processing a permit. For projects that have investment needs of billions of dollars, the impact of these delays should not be underestimated. The Promoting New Manufacturing Act removes much of this uncertainty by ensuring that the EPA has issued final guidance to permit applicants on the exact manner in which to conduct the permitting analyses associated with capital projects. Guidance is necessary as many technical issues must be addressed in determining how to conduct the analyses that can show compliance with the ambient air quality standards. This is particularly important as EPA is constantly updating the ambient air quality standards. EPA recently tightened the NAAQS for nitrogen dioxide and sulfur oxides in 2010 and fine particle matter in 2012, and is expected to issue a tighter ozone standard later this year. At the same time, the agency is working to implement these standards along with some older NAAQS, including the 1997 and 2008 ozone NAAQS and the 1997 and 2006 particulate matter NAAQS. This disconnect results in state permitting agencies and the regulated community in not having clear direction from EPA regarding what needs to be done to complete the air pre-construction permitting process. EPA's failure to provide final implementation rules and guidance to the regulated community and state agencies is easily documented. Using the fine particle matter standard as an example, it was not until May 16, 2008 that EPA promulgated its final rule for implementation of the New Source Review Program for fine particle matter Despite having promulgated the NAAQS in 1977 and 2006, importantly, the 2008 rule required certain gases to be considered precursor emissions to fine particle formation. Precursor emissions are emitted as gases, but react in the atmosphere to form particulate matter, such as sulfate and nitrates. Despite having adopted this rule in 2008, even today there is no final guidance available from EPA on how to conduct a fine particle matter ambient air quality analysis, nor is there any approved computer model available to analyze emissions surrounding the chemical transformation of precursor emissions into particulate matter, a major contributor to fine particle concentrations in the ambient air. The most recent guidance from EPA on how to conduct this analysis is labeled draft and was issued in March of 2013. It's not been finalized now more than a year since its release. Affected sources have no choice but to be left with uncertainty. We routinely advise clients that obtaining a PSD permit can obtain anywhere from 1 to 3 years, and that a minimum of 12 to 18 months need to be allowed in the project schedule. The types of issues we've seen have included a large shale gas-fired combustion turbine that was being constructed right in the middle of adoption of the PM 2.5 NAAQS. The new, more stringent NAAQS could not be met in the area of the project location, so there was no way to make the required air quality demonstrations. EPA guidance was non-existent, and the state did not know how to resolve this issue. This caused unnecessary project delays for a major new gas turbine. We worked on a steel plant in Louisiana that was delayed due to issues surrounding the NO2 ambient air quality standard that was adopted during review of the permit application and more than a year after the application was filed. We currently estimate that the lack of guidance added 2 years to the project schedule. The above examples are just a few of the obstacles we've experienced firsthand. The list of obstacles will grow as more facilities apply pre-construction permits and as the NAAQS continue to get more stringent. Additionally, by requiring the EPA to determine its track records to meeting the permit processing timeline, the agency will have the information necessary to act on and remove the underlying causes of project delays and created unintentionally by the permitting program. Thanks for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Our next witness is Mr. Colin O'Mara. Good to see you. Who's Secretary of the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, and we're glad you're with us and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Rush, I greatly appreciate you accommodating me being a last-minute add to this panel, replacing my staff member. I'll actually be starting a new job in 2 months. This will probably be the last time I'll be before you in this capacity. I'm going to become the CEO of the National Wildlife Federation. So you'll be hearing me to bother you about wildlife issues in the future, maybe a little less on the Clean Air Act. But
Mr. Chairman, I just want to extend congratulations to him.
Thank you.
Yeah, for the promotion.
I'll be in Illinois soon, so.
Yeah, and we have a lot of issues we want to talk to you about on wildlife, too.
Hey, nothing's as sticky as this stuff, so. Thank you very much for having me today. Delaware has a long, proud history of manufacturing. You know, companies like DuPont, Gore, you know, we have a refinery, all kinds, you know, the chemical industry in many ways really grew out of Delaware. And we actually agree with the premise of this effort that more efficient permitting, more predictable, more clear and certain permitting is obviously a good thing for economic growth. We just kind of question the unintended consequences of this particular approach and have maybe a few suggestions for a different way to look at it. In Delaware, under the leadership of Governor Jack Markell, we've focused like a laser on trying to improve permitting efficiency. You know, my air director sitting behind me, Ali Mirzakalili, one of the finest air directors in the country, put his team through an incredible process of value stream mapping, trying to reduce permit times. He's gone for, you know, our permits for kind of major sources take about 4 months, where in many other states it's more than a year. Our minor sources will take 2 months. We're about 72 days right now, compared to about 104 days, about 3.5 months, about 3 or 4 years ago. And so we've shown that we can actually, by having a better process, we can get through the permits more quickly, providing the certainty. And that's really the key to our approach in Delaware. The approach is fairly simple. We want to provide certainty to industry by articulating clear standards. We want to deliver permits in a timely and efficient manner, so they get the decisions they need. And then we actually supplement our strategy with one other piece. We actually provide some incentives. If folks are willing to go above and beyond permitting requirements, we provide, you know, small grants. They want, you know, maybe adopting cleaner fuels or helping them get, you know, a gas pipeline to the site, or, you know, things that can actually make the facility better long run. And it's because we strongly believe in the underlying belief in the Clean Air Act and the tenet of the Clean Air Act that it's much cheaper to reduce emissions during the design of a facility than it is to try to retrofit later. You know, a lot of these facilities across the country that have tried to, you know, add controls later, and you've heard this in response to the toxics rule and others about how the expense and the time that folks need to try to do it after the fact. If we can figure out ways to incorporate these technologies earlier, it's cheaper and it doesn't create kind of unintended consequences in other facilities. And I think that the challenge with this bill as proposed, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come in at the draft discussion level before it's formally introduced, before it's marked up, because the unintended consequence of having folks go in and apply for permits under an old standard when a new standard's already been promulgated in a meaningful way, even though the guidance may not have been issued, puts both the state and the regulated entity in an incredibly precarious position. The regulated entity is basically knowingly not putting the controls that would be necessary for the standard that is promulgated that's fully in the federal rules, federal code at that point. So there's a potential legal liability there. The state then has to figure out other places to make up the reductions that could have been more cost effectively reduced through the controls being put on at this new facility. And so what ends up happening is it might help that individual facility if they'd have to do less on the control side. The challenge is those reductions that could have been achieved have to be made up somewhere else. And so as we're trying to put together our state implementation plans, we might have to go back to an existing industry that has already put on a lot of controls, trying to get that extra additional ton out of that facility because this other facility didn't kind of do their fair share. The other kind of inequity that we could create unintentionally is that a new facility that comes in after the guidance, so you could have two facilities, same type of operation, say both gas turbine generation. One that comes in before the guidance is promulgated, one that comes in afterwards. The one that comes in afterwards is going to have to meet a higher standard, creating another inequity there where they're doing more to go above and beyond the requirements of exactly the same facility in the same state. We would much rather see ways to really kind of incentivize the folks to go above and beyond the permit conditions rather than having this inequity of the types of standards that different folks meet. And it really comes back to the underlying the underlying assumption that I will challenge in the bill that states aren't doing a good job figuring this out. EPA has had slow guidance on many of these rules. I mean, the 2008 is a good example, but that doesn't paralyze the states in any meaningful way. We are talking to each other all the time. We are moving ahead. Frankly, a lot of times the way that we issue permits in Delaware and a lot of the East Coast states are actually more efficient and more flexible than the way the guidance actually comes out later. Like actually not having the guidance and allowing us to implement under just the rule allows us to be more nimble and actually help industry in a significant way. And so, I do respect the intent. I mean, there's no one that supports manufacturing more than me, a kid that grew up in upstate New York and Syracuse. That's kind of the heart of the Rust Belt that needs these kind of jobs. But we think we can actually achieve our quality goals in a much more efficient way, not have adverse public health impacts, because we will have additional pollution if this does kind of go into effect. That's going to be very difficult to pull out of the system later. And we would love to work with you on a more efficient way to do it, because we firmly believe that manufacturing is absolutely critical, but we think we can do a little better than this proposal.
Thanks very much, Mr. O'Mara. At this time, our next witness is Mr. John Walk, who's the Senior Attorney and Director for the Climate and Clean Air Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And Mr. Walk, welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. The draft legislation before you, in our opinion, is a flawed bill that would authorize amnesty from national clean air health standards, create red tape, and impose unintended burdens on local businesses. Instead of reducing permitting burdens, the bill would open up facilities to new legal liabilities, higher costs, and regulatory delays. I suspect many of these outcomes are unintended consequences of the draft bill, but these objectionable substantive elements of the draft legislation are coupled with a false premise and lack of foundation for its central approach. I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss the individual sections of the draft bill and why they are problematic. Section 3 of the bill is the most problematic part of the draft bill. It creates an unjustified amnesty from new or revised national clean air health standards during pre-construction permitting for individual facilities undertaking new construction or modifications. This would harm air quality, the health of surrounding communities, and impose unfair burdens and costs on other local businesses in the same area as the facility receiving the amnesty. The bill would create unintended consequences and increase costs for other businesses in that same area. This is because the Clean Air Act still would require EPA, state and local officials, to attain national health standards and to avoid interfering with clean air resources in areas that already meet national health standards. The only way for regulators to accomplish this would be for government regulators to crack down on other businesses in the area, or to require the newly permitted facility to either stop operating or undertake potentially costly retrofits to install necessary pollution controls. Imposing additional costs and control obligations on existing local businesses in order to grant amnesty to a newly constructed facility is inequitable and even punitive in our view. There is no reason to impose these terrible choices on facility owners or operators, nor on state and local regulators, local businesses, and local communities. Nor is there any reason for doing damage to the Clean Air Act's health safeguards in the manner that we believe Section 3 of the bill would. None of the written testimony before you today has concrete examples of air permits not being issued due to a lack of EPA implementing rules or guidance. I am personally unaware of situations in which EPA implementation rules or guidance were deemed necessary to the issuance of pre-construction permits following revisions to national health standards. Pre-construction permits, as Mr. O'Mara has indicated, continue to be issued while national air quality standards are being revised and updated. Delays and uncertainty are not welcome, to be sure. But uncertainty for corporations should not come at the expense of subjecting Americans to the certainty of unhealthy and illegal levels of air pollution in the manner that the bill's amnesty provision would. Turning to Sections 2 and 4 of the draft bill. These provisions represent red tape that consume limited agency resources in order to compile information mostly in the possession of state and local agencies rather than EPA. These sections require EPA to collect information on pre-construction permitting, but overlook the fact that over 80% of the states oversee their own pre-construction permitting. EPA rarely permits individual facilities, actually, and it makes little sense for Congress to require this information from EPA rather than from individual state and local permitting authorities. In light of this permitting landscape, the question then becomes whether it makes sense to saddle resource-constrained state and local governments with red tape at the expense of carrying out and enforcing health safeguards that protect Americans. We do not think this makes much sense. Lastly, the draft legislation manages to run afoul of all 5 congressional declarations of purposes behind the Clean Air Act's pre-construction permitting program in clean areas, or so-called attainment areas. The Act's pre-construction permitting program was written into law by Congress to ensure that newly constructed or modified stationary sources do not violate national health standards, do not interfere with a state's plan for meeting and continuing to meet those health standards, do not harm national parks, and do not impose unfair burdens and additional costs on other local businesses in an area when a newly permitted facility wishes to construct and add higher pollution levels. The draft bill contravenes all of these statutory objectives. Today's bill, in our view, represents a sharp departure from the Clean Air Act and 37 years of permitting practices. EPA updates national health standards when the science shows that standards should be strengthened to protect Americans with an adequate margin of safety. Providing facilities amnesty from national health standards does a disservice to permit holders, other local businesses, air quality, and public health. I urge the subcommittee not to advance the draft bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walk. And our next witness is Ms. Karen Kerrigan, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to participate and provide the views of the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council this morning on legislative efforts to promote new manufacturing and growth in the United States. Again, I'm Karen Kerrigan, President and CEO of SBE Council, and we're a nonprofit advocacy, research, and training organization dedicated to protecting small business and promoting entrepreneurship. And for 20 years, SBE Council and our members have worked to develop and support policies that enable business startup and growth. We are pleased to lend our support to the Promoting New Manufacturing Act. This draft bill is a practical measure that aligns with bipartisan goals to improve government and transparency and strengthen quality job growth and investment in the United States. The legislation contains reasonable accountability features that will serve to provide businesses with the timely information they need to make decisions and plan. Provisions that require the EPA to better monitor, make public, and report on the timing of permits, and to provide timely and concurrent guidance and rules about how to comply with new or revised air quality standards will establish greater clarity and certainty for businesses and investors. This is especially critical given the potential for new manufacturing in the U.S., a positive development that will lead to quality job growth and opportunities for small businesses and entrepreneurs. Now, the figures, as you noted, Chairman, and also provided by Ms. Gershom of the American Chemistry Council, are indeed impressive, and there is a lot of small business opportunity in those projects. Opportunities for struggling small businesses and the potential for new business startup and growth. And this is an area where our economy needs help. That is, we need more entrepreneurship and growing small businesses that hire full-time employees. Unfortunately, ongoing reports find that we are flailing in this critical area. However, there is one sector where we are excelling, and that's in energy. Beyond the benefits of transparency and clarity the Promoting New Manufacturing Act would bring to the permitting process, small businesses in the energy sector would continue to benefit from the growth in natural gas demand that new or expanded facilities would generate. The tremendous increase in domestic natural gas production has been a significant development for small business. Entrepreneurship and business formation in the energy sector in recent years has been extraordinary. In a report released by our organization in June of 2013, we found that at the same time that both employment and employer firms declined between 2005 and 2010, job growth and new business formation grew within the energy sector and continues to this day. I provided those detailed numbers in my written testimony, but again, the growth in new businesses is particularly striking among small firms. President Obama recognized the opportunities and potential in shale gas development in his State of the Union speech this past January. He pledged to cut red tape to help states to get those factories built, referenced in his speech and based on the ACC's numbers. The Promoting New Manufacturing Act is an opportunity to advance an initiative that appears aligned with the President's pledge. Bringing greater transparency and accountability to the pre-construction permit program is one way both parties can work together to help revitalize manufacturing and strengthen U.S. competitiveness. More growth opportunities for small businesses and new manufacturing projects and the energy sector will produce a virtual cycle of increased investment, enhanced GDP growth, rising incomes, and more jobs. Thank you again, Chairman and Ranking Member Rush. I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. And our final witness is Mr. Ross Eisenberg, who is the Vice President for Energy and Resources Policy at the National Manufacturers Association. And thanks for being with us, Mr. Eisenberg. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Of course, thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the subcommittee. As you've heard from the National Association of Manufacturers and our 12,000 members for many years now, the boom in domestic energy production is driving major new investment in manufacturing and contributing to increased U.S. competitiveness around the world. For us, for manufacturers, this could mean as many as 1 million new jobs by 2025 as we build new iron, steel, cement, fertilizer, chemicals, aluminum, plastics, and many other manufacturing facilities, as well as the products that are made from these materials. So the future is good. We understand as manufacturers the risks inherent in making investments of this magnitude in the United States. We understand that even with our built-in energy advantage, we still have a significant disadvantage owing to other policies like taxes and torts and regulations. We understand that new regulations will be issued while we wait for our permit, moving the goalpost and forcing us to change our entire plan midstream. We understand that often law firms masquerading as public interest groups will exploit every step of the approval process and drive up project costs in the hopes that we will simply want to walk away. We understand that all of this is going to happen, and we still take these risks, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to do something about it. So with manufacturing on the verge of a major comeback, there's really no better time, in our view, than now for the subcommittee to examine the permitting process and whether or not it can be improved, and if so, how. Manufacturers continue to struggle with the complex requirements of the New Source Review Program. When I was preparing for today's hearing, I sent a note to our members. I reached out to our members asking for their feedback on what is good and what is bad about the NSR process. What I got back is listed in my written testimony. It's long. The intention here was not to create a list of horribles, and I do understand that that's probably what it looks like, but rather to try to give members an honest assessment of what the plant managers, the business owners, the EH&S people at my members in the field are having to do when they try to build facilities or modify existing ones. Challenges they raised with me in the NSR process include change permit conditions that derail the project, a mandatory stay on construction when a project is challenged at the EAB level, modeling issues of which they say there are very, very, very many, barriers to installation of energy efficiency and combined heat and power that the NSR process provides, threats of litigation on the back end, which then create delays on the front end as you try to sort of judgment-proof the permit, uncertainty on how to address remands when permits are sent back, and even delays they're finding for simple minor source permits that don't even trigger the PSD process. And the EPA, to its credit, has listened to manufacturers' permit concerns, and it is aware of many of these problems and is actively trying to fix them. But we believe Congress can and should be part of the solution as well. Now, I'd like to also talk about what appears to be a real problem in the functioning of the PSD program for greenhouse gases. For several years, the NAM and other groups in this town have warned the members of the subcommittee that extending the PSD permitting program to greenhouse gases could act as a deterrent to construction. Based on the numbers of permits completed to date, I'm concerned that we may have actually been correct in that respect. When EPA issued the greenhouse gas tailoring rule 4 years ago, it estimated that even with tailoring, it would have to issue about 900 permits per year. So by now, about 1,800 permits. However, recent information from the agency shows that in those 3+ years, they've only, since PSD was extended to greenhouse gases, they've only done 166 permits total, rather than 1,800. So that's a stunning drop-off, and one for which the agency really doesn't seem to have an easy answer. I think we should figure out why. We at NAM fear that PSD for greenhouse gases may actually be acting as a deterrent to new construction. So we believe that the pre-construction permitting process can be improved. But we don't really believe this should be a partisan or even a contentious issue. Many of the problems identified can be addressed through a collaborative process involving EPA, Congress, and the regulated community in the states. Frankly, I'm a little surprised by the reaction to this bill from some of my colleagues here on the panel. Let's be clear about what we're arguing about here. We're talking about some additional reporting requirements and requiring that EPA issue a document in a timely fashion. That's really it. That's what we're arguing about here. So we believe that Promoting New Manufacturing Act takes a pragmatic approach to this very complex issue. It diagnoses a problem if one exists and provides the best available information so that EPA and the Congress can then decide if steps needed to be taken to improve the process. And it requires the agency to do its job issuing guidance in a timely fashion. Given that a very, very large revision to the ozone NAAQS, quite possibly the most expensive new regulation that will ever be issued, and I say that in all seriousness, is due by the end of next year, this is a relatively small task to require from the agency. If the EPA expects implementation of this major new reg to begin immediately upon its issuance, then it must at a minimum issue the tools and develop the tools manufacturers are going to need to comply with it. So we appreciate the time and attention that the subcommittee is giving to the pre-construction permitting process. We thank you. Manufacturers look forward to working with you and the entire subcommittee on this bill and on other measures that will enhance our manufacturing comeback. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. And this time I would like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, and then we'll go to the other members. Ms. Gershman, you had mentioned in your testimony and other witnesses also about the 177 projects, and that 62% of this would be foreign investment. Is the Chemistry Council, are you all tracking these projects? And could you give us an update on your analysis of that?
Certainly. We've been tracking publicly announced projects, so nothing in any of our numbers are secret. It's all gathered from press releases that companies themselves have made. The 177 new projects that I've referenced include projects in the petrochemical, resins, fertilizer, chlor-alkali, and organic chemical sectors. There's an even larger number of announced projects in other industries resulting from the use of shale gas, which includes iron and steel, tires, and many manufacturing plastic processors and resins as well.
Now, you know, one of the frustrating things obviously about Congress today is that there seems to be very little agreement on much of anything. But on expediting the permitting process, even the President is talking about the need for that. The states come to us frequently and talk about the need for that. Mr. O'Mara talks that in Delaware things seem to be going relatively well, but other than, I mean, Mr. Walk may disagree and not think anything really needs to be changed, but Mr. Walk, would I be accurate in saying that in your view really nothing does need to be changed about this permitting process right now?
No, we would support the expedition of permits, just not at the expense of granting amnesty from health standards. That's been the focus of my testimony.
But there are some methods to expedite that you all would be supportive of.
Certainly. We'd be happy to join that conversation.
And Mr. O'Mara, now you said that you had some ideas on this, and because, like I said, the states have complained to us about lack of direction. We've heard a lot of witnesses talk about it, but evidently it's not an issue in Delaware. What are some areas that you think we should be looking at that maybe we're not looking at right now?
I mean, some of the conversations that you facilitated last year, actually, I think had some good kind of bipartisan ideas around greater communication with EPA. And I mean, one of the hang-ups that happens in some other regions, I'm fairly blessed in Region 3 that we're talking to our regional administrator all the time. And
Are you referring to the forums?
Yeah, the forums that you held.
Okay.
I mean, one area for greater collaboration is working with EPA prior to submittal. So the states will send it back for the final review, and sometimes they get sent back, get remanded. That process, if there's greater coordination on the front end, can avoid a lot of the misunderstanding. And so you've seen some issues in some other states where there isn't that coordination on the front end. You end up with this kind of torturous cycle. If you can actually cut the back end, that provides a lot more certainty. I also think transparency could really help. We try to be very transparent with our applicants, about, this is the date the draft permit's going to be issued, this is the date of the hearing, this is the date the decision will be made, so they can build that into their plan, because time is money. I mean, the cost of the permit is a fraction of the opportunity cost of not getting implemented. So, more transparency there at the state and local level, though, as Mr. Welk was saying, rather than at EPA's level, because it really is a local decision. And then the last is actually around money. A lot of the cuts to EPA have been in the AIR program in the last few years, and those are resources that actually pay for much of the staff that would be putting out the guidance that we're complaining is being delayed. Some of that trickles through to the states because the state grants get cut also, and so then we're trying to do more with less, trying to get things out. And so having more efficient permitting, having sufficient staff to deliver permitting, more transparency, and then encouraging additional investment, I think could be a good package that everyone could agree to.
Mr. Eisenberg, are you personally aware of projects that have actually just been abandoned because of the complications of this permitting process?
Yes, I am. The members themselves ask that I not reveal who they are, but yeah, I mean, without a doubt, it just gets to a point, and this is not, these happen, sometimes they don't happen. So I don't want to make generalizations here, but yeah, I have members that walked away from projects because the permitting process was taking too long, or the modeling got to a point where they just couldn't, there was no way that they could build this facility to meet the standards that were being put in place.
I'm glad that you raised the greenhouse gas issue, because the endangerment finding, and even with the tailoring rule, I think EPA recognizes that they are going to have some significant issues, and those numbers that you gave about the 900 per year, and they've issued like 166, and I guess the endangerment finding was in 2009. So I think that's a very real issue, and but I think all of us recognize the need to try to come up with a solution, and I hope that we have an opportunity all working together to do that. My time's expired, so at this time I recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary O'Mara, we often hear from regulated industries about the importance of regulatory certainty in making investment decisions. We even heard from some of the witnesses today. But this bill will do nothing to enhance regulatory certainty. In fact, it just confuses 40 years of Clean Air Act practices. Has your state ever been unable to issue pre-construction permits because EPA has not issued guidance for a new air quality standard? And is this a situation that states have the ability to handle?
Thank you for the question. We were the first state to sign the Constitution, so we have no problem kind of blazing ahead. And frankly, in the case of times where there isn't guidance, we keep working hard. We don't wait. And so we'll coordinate with EPA. We'll make sure they know what we're doing. But it's never held us up. I've permitted, hundreds of megawatts of combined gas plants. I've permitted big, a restart of a refinery, permitted, and big expansions of units, all kinds of energy projects in our state. And, we're turning around permits very, very quickly. It hasn't slowed us down at all, as long as we're communicating during the process.
Do you agree with the assertion that this bill will provide greater transparency and timeliness in obtaining pre-construction permits for new manufacturing facilities? And secondly, how does the EPA's role differentiate from the state role in the process, and how will this bill impact that relationship?
I think that the concept of transparency is a good one, because I do think that there's additional public pressure that can be applied to permits that are languishing if it's more clear about what timelines are and kind of where things are stuck in the process. I think it's at the wrong level in the bill, frankly. I mean, does EPA headquarters have to have a list on their website of projects in Delaware, or should Delaware have that list? And as many of you know that have served on state and local legislative bodies, I mean, there's nothing more effective to expedite decision making than having folks in having those kind of timelines public, because folks are held accountable. And so I think in terms of consistency, I think it actually creates more confusion, because you'll have different standards and there'll be a lack of clarity for both the regulator and the industry. And I think the transparency should really be more focused at the state and local level instead of the federal level.
This bill assumes that it's a huge problem if EPA does not issue rules and guidance at the same time as a new air quality standard. So the bill allows a facility to obtain a pre-construction permit pegged to an old air quality standard if the EPA hasn't issued rules and guidance. Does this facilitate permitting, or does it create new avenues for litigation and delay, in your opinion?
Well, it's important to recognize that, in the 37 years of this permitting program, it's been a requirement that new facilities meet revised health standards after they've been adopted. So the history of the past 37 years, and I'm not going to argue is an ideal history, but it shows that we can and do regularly every year, every month, issue pre-construction permits at the same time that there are these standards changing. What puzzles me about the bill is by granting amnesty to these newly constructed facilities, so for the first time ever in the Clean Air Act, they don't have to meet updated health standards. It poses a dilemma that Mr. O'Mara pointed out. These facilities would actually model violations of the new standards, and some of the witnesses have indicated that that has happened previously. But I don't believe the bill intends to grant perpetual amnesty from revised health standards. There's some vagueness about the bill that my written testimony addresses. But if that's the case, then a facility has to come back again after the fact with an after-the-fact permitting exercise, retrofit control exercise, and in the meantime, other businesses are suffering the burden of additional pollution controls that I think are probably also unintended consequences of the bill. So I'm not going to argue that the system we have today is perfect or could not stand improvement, but I think this actually takes us backwards. It certainly does on the health front. I think it does vis-a-vis permitting of the individual facility, and certainly for the other local businesses in that area.
I'd like to just ask one additional question of both you and Mr. O'Mara. Would you speak about public health? What's the impact on public health if this bill will go forward?
Right now, there are 30 million Americans, particularly on the East Coast, that are living with unhealthy air. And and I think in Delaware, where 90% of our pollution comes from out-of-state sources, the idea of new facilities coming in, being allowed to pollute more than the technology, cost-effective technology, would allow, to not capture those reductions that are much cheaper than going back to an existing facility where it might cost 50 times as much to add pollution controls to an older facility. It's economically inefficient. But I mean, this is what affects kids. I mean, I have a 2-year-old daughter. I mean, the idea that she's breathing air that's unhealthy on a lot of days is painful. Seniors, other disadvantaged populations. So at the end of the day, it's about people, and I think there's ways to avoid some of those impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. There's been some comment about the burden on EPA of posting on its website. I might note that in their budget documents, they already provide information on the percent of permits that they are issuing, so they already have a lot of this information. But this time I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing, and I thank all of the panelists for coming and providing the testimony and for answering our questions. I know there are a lot of questions that we have. We get agencies that come up. EPA is one of those agencies that we have a lot of questions for, because frankly, when you talk to people that are trying to create jobs out in the country, I know in South Louisiana, Unfortunately, the biggest impediment that they tell me about when they're sharing their challenges at creating more jobs in America are the regulations and the lack of guidance, the lack of obtainable type of standards that are coming out of Washington. And that's not the way that government should work. Government should not be the impediment to American job creation because, and I think a few have touched on this, I've seen it, many cases when businesses are making decisions of where to make investment, they're not just saying, I'm going to make it in Louisiana or I'm going to make it in Delaware. They're looking at other countries. And we're losing some of these jobs to other countries because we're not getting clear guidance from Washington. And the EPA is one of the worst offenders. And let's be honest about this. When you look at some of the problems that we've seen from EPA, one of the reasons that this bill is necessary, and all it says, by the way, is that when they come out with some proposed rule, they have to concurrently publish regulations and guidance for implementing the rule. Just tell people how to implement it. Because a lot of times what we see is these rules have nothing to do with improving air quality. The rules are designed to literally try to inhibit people's ability to get a permit. That's not the government's role, to stop people from making investment in this country and creating jobs. And by the way, when those jobs go to those other countries, Brazil or India or China, you name it, we've got a list. When they go to those other countries, they don't use the standards that we have today. They emit more carbon. They don't follow the same kind of environmental regulations we already have. And yet when these new standards come out, so often they're not about improving health and safety. It's about denying an industry. The president brags about the war on coal, saying he's going to bankrupt the coal industry. He doesn't want to see coal plants be more efficient. He wants to see them shut down, and he's doing it. That's not the role of the federal government. So when we talk about this, I want to at least get some questions answered about this investment that I hear about, that others hear about. We hear about over $100 billion of investment that's waiting to happen. Really good high-paying jobs in America. Obviously, Louisiana would be one of those states that would benefit, but so many other states across the country would. I want to ask Ms. Kerrigan and Mr. Eisenberg, because y'all are there on the front lines, can you share with us some of the stories you know? I mean, are these numbers right? Are they low? Maybe high? When we hear about $100 billion of investment that's waiting, and we just want guidance, want clear guidelines so that people can play by the rules. If you can share first, Ms. Kerrigan.
$100 billion is a lot of money, even if it was half of that. I mean, that's significant, in terms of investment that could be made in this country. And when you look at the uncertainty of this issue in general, I mean, it really does filter down to the small businesses. The individual firms and small businesses that are planning to work on these projects or are contracted to work on these projects. There's a lot of planning that they need to do in terms of financing, in terms of human capital acquisition, in terms of investing in new assets, et cetera, et cetera. So if there's delay or any type of delay or derailment, I mean, this is very costly to business owners and entrepreneurs, and it could be catastrophic for some. If these projects, if they are planning to work on them, they've made the investment, and the project falls through. So, but
and Mr. Eisenberg, because I know you talked about the folks that you've heard directly. I've heard directly of plants that have moved to other countries because of the inability to get any kind of guidance and direction and get a permit to move forward and do something in a safe and effective manner in this country. I mean, can you tell me about the $100 billion number? Give me a ballpark of what you think the number is that's out there of projects, manufacturing jobs that are ready to go.
Sure. So we've had a couple different economists look at this using the information that's out there, publicly available information, and also doing some research within the sectors. And there's two that we've put out. One is the one that we put out, supported, that PwC did a couple years ago, that said, if we actually fully develop the shale resource that we have, then based on the direct sort of upstream, midstream, drilling kind of jobs, and then the manufacturing facilities that will then build out from all the energy, we could be creating, just with the manufacturing, 1 million jobs by 2025. We supported a study, as did ACC and a few other groups, that IHS Global Insight did a couple of years ago, about a year ago, that looked at the natural gas value chain and chemicals. So it didn't get as far as PwC, but it took a much deeper dive, and it forecasted for manufacturing about 500 million new jobs by 2025. The numbers have been pretty consistent. The amount of the amount of development down there is really staggering. I mean, anecdotally, I have members come in and say, look, we can't build fast enough because we literally can't find the people to do it. You know, we have a pipe fitter that shows up for work one day and then the guy down the street outbids me for him the next day. So there's a lot waiting to happen down there if we can figure
And
out
I appreciate what y'all do in trying to create jobs in America. A lot of people up here talk about helping small businesses. There are real things we can actually do. This bill is one of them. There's no amnesty in this bill. This bill just says if you're going to put a new standard out, EPA, you've got, I mean, if one of your companies misses a deadline for filing the permit, they don't get the permit. EPA's missed deadlines over and over again. There just ought to be some transparency and make the standard obtainable. Show how you can actually get it done. Don't put a standard out just to put somebody out of business and run those jobs to China. That's what we're trying to do here, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman.
Hearing yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to clarify something that you made, a statement that you made,
That I made?
Yeah, you made that the EPA has the reporting data in its budget document. Mr. Chairman, we checked with the EPA, and the EPA, we asked the EPA whether they had data on state permitting times, and the EPA maintains that a database of the air pollution technologies required in major pre-construction permits. They do have a database, but it's voluntary. States are not required to report on that system, report to the system. Some states report voluntarily, other states report their most significant permits, and some may not do much reporting at all. The EPA estimates that perhaps only 50% of all pre-construction permits make it into that database. Only 50%, Mr. Chairman. This means that to get the data required by the EPA is going to have to, required by this bill rather, the EPA is going to have to impose new mandatory reporting requirements on the states. And Mr. Chairman, I don't see how that will speed up state permitting. And if we had made it possible for the EPA to testify today, we could have heard this from the agency firsthand. And I just wanted to clarify the comments that you made a little earlier, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. I commend you for this hearing. My questions at first will be for Mr. Walk, Director of Climate and Clean Air Program. Sir, the Clean Air Act requires EPA to set protective air quality standards for pollutants, and states have the primary responsibility to meet these standards. The bill before us appears to ignore this division of responsibility and labor. Section 2 requires EPA to post information about permits issued by EPA, state, and local permitting authorities. Section 4 appears to require that EPA report on permit delays and actions EPA is taking to address delays for permits issued not only by EPA but also by state and local permitting authorities. Now, Mr. Walk, you have testified that state and local permitting authorities, not EPA, issue most of the pre-construction permits in this country. Does any of the other, or do any of the other panelists disagree with that statement? Okay, thank you, gentlemen and ladies. Now, this means then that Section 2 is requiring EPA to report on what scores of state and local permitting authorities are doing. To your knowledge, does EPA currently have the information that's required by Section 2? Yes or no?
No, sir, I do not believe they do.
Okay. Does anybody disagree with that statement?
I actually think that there might be a question as to what information EPA has versus does not have. In the appropriations language for fiscal year 2015, there is a performance metric in there for EPA that states that it's tracking the number of major permits that are being issued each year. And there's a percentage target of 78% that are issued within a year. But what we do not know is where that number comes from.
Thank you very much. It also appears that Section 4 would require EPA to go through public notice and comment to prepare an annual report on delays in pre-construction permits issued not only by EPA, but also by state and local permitting authorities. Ms. Secretary, is that right?
Yes.
Now, to your knowledge, does EPA have or regularly collect information from state and local permitting authorities on the specific reason for delays in issuing permits? Yes or no?
Not formally. There's a lot of conversation, but not,
Now,
not in every
Mr.
permit.
Secretary, if EPA doesn't publish implementation guidance or is late in so doing, are state permitting agencies equipped to issue pre-construction permits in a timely manner? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Secretary, the bill creates a loophole that could allow a new facility to meet an old air quality standard. Will this do anything to help the the state of Delaware process its permits faster? Yes or no?
No.
You're going to be finding yourself in the awkward position of approving permits to an old standard rather than the new and the current one. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, the language of Section 3 is also ripe for litigation. Do you agree with that? And if so, could you please elaborate?
Yes, I do believe that it is, because there's an open question about whether when the new standard, the new standard is already in place, but when the guidance is then finalized, whether the facility that was permitted without the guidance under the old standard would then have to make immediate retrofit and upgrades to it, setting up citizen suits, setting up legal challenges, setting up inequity with other firms. So the legal uncertainty is significant, we believe.
So it sort of appears here that we may be imposing by the legislation additional burdens that are unproductive rather than by reducing the burdens. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your recognition. I commend our panel. I hope that we've been listening to my dear friend, Mr. Rush, who is very wise in these matters, and I thank you for your courtesy to me and panel. Thank you for your courtesy.
Yeah, we always listen to him. Thank you, Mr. Dingell. At this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for our panelists for being here today. Just, again, I always like to just kind of preface what I'm going to say with a little bit about my district and the state of Ohio, and also what goes on, I think, in manufacturing. I've got 60,000 manufacturing jobs in my district. I not only have 60,000 manufacturing jobs, since my staff actually started keeping track, in the last 22 months, I've done about 500 visits in my district to manufacturing facilities, businesses, you name it, across it. The number one issue I hear from everybody out in my district are federal regulations. And when the SBA came out with their statistics a couple of years ago showing that in 2011 we had $1.7 trillion of regulations out there, that was a problem. But now when we look at the update probably for this year in 2014, we're looking at about $1.9 trillion. I've never had any of my businesses out there that have ever gone through, small, medium, or large, ever say that they were against clean air or against clean water. But what we're looking at is a problem with the number of these trying to comply, and also with the EPA always being the number one issue out there. Now, one of the things that I was in one plant, and it was a very large manufacturer. They probably had a table about the size of what we see across here, and it was full of all these books and everything else. And they said one thing to me, you know, one of the problems we have is trying to comply with this, but the problem that they had was the EPA was trying to tell them to take a square peg, pound it through a round hole, because those issues or those regulations didn't even work for their plant. So it really comes down to we want to make sure that, you know, we have everybody on the same cylinders, because as we've heard from our witnesses today, especially for the number of jobs that are out there that we have and the potential in the future are very, very important. So, Mr. Eisenberg, if I can start with you. You note in your testimony that revisions to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards can affect the ability to obtain air permits, and you specifically referenced the potential revisions to the ozone standards. And can you explain?
Yes, thank you. So we are now at a level that was put in place in 2008, was recently affirmed by the D.C. Circuit, of 75 parts per billion for national ambient air quality standards for ground level ozone. Those levels are subject to change every 5 years, subject to revision. We are in the middle of one of those cycles right now. EPA is on a deadline to put out new ozone NACs in December of this year and finalize them by October of next year. The last go-round, EPA's numbers were about $90 billion a year. We're looking at it, and we're thinking that it could actually be a little bit higher than it. The reason, quite frankly, is that we've made a lot of progress here on ozone, and we're getting to a point where the gains are getting a lot more expensive because, quite frankly, a lot of the technologies that would be required to get down to some of these levels just don't actually exist, and you have to get very, very creative and do things that may be a little unconventional and a lot more expensive than we would expect. I do, if I could take a second, one of the big assumptions here that we're making on this bill in terms of, some of the slippery slope downstream problems that it could cause is that if you, the Congress, were to tell EPA that it has to do this guidance concurrently, that it wouldn't do it. And then all these bad things would happen. We hope that EPA would do it and that these problems would be avoided. Again, if EPA just didn't do it and ignored the statute, then yeah, you could be creating some unintended consequences, and you certainly would do that in the case of ozone. We would hope that certainly for ozone and for something that's going to cost that much, that we could get this guidance concurrently so that we're not just stuck in limbo as the goalposts are moved.
Thank you. Ms. Kerrigan, if I could ask, you refer in your testimony to the complex and tentative regulatory permitting process that businesses face in this country. Do you believe that it is important to look for ways to expedite the permitting process, and is that critical for job growth in this economy that we have?
Absolutely. Look, we've heard the other testimony and the investment dollars that are out there and that are willing to, that are going to be invested in these projects. And from a small business perspective, when I hear numbers like the ACC's numbers in terms of $100 billion, I think small business. I think small business opportunity, new business formation, new jobs, all the things that our economy needs to get back to robust growth and back to competitiveness again. So not only in permitting, but in other areas. If there's, if government can improve and it can work better, if it can work in collaboration with the business community, that's going to get these investment dollars flowing and get our economy back to robust levels of growth again.
Well, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired, and I yield back.
This time, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several concerns about this bill. It follows the House Republicans' mantra that the way to produce jobs is to weaken environmental protections. I don't believe that's the case. It assumes that EPA is the problem. Even here, where states are issuing almost all of these permits. In fact, the bill would likely slow permitting by diverting state and EPA resources and adding legal uncertainty. But I want to focus on another problem. Section 3 of the bill undermines decades of Clean Air Act practice and weakens air quality protections. The Clean Air Act requires a large, new, or expanding industrial facility to get an air pollution permit before starting construction. The facility must commit to install pollution controls. It must demonstrate that its emissions won't produce unhealthy levels of air pollution in the area. And if the facility's pollution would cause the area to violate an air pollution standard, then the facility must do more to reduce or offset its emissions. Well, this bill creates a loophole in the law. If EPA fails to meet new procedural requirements, the bill would allow a facility to get a permit by measuring its emissions against an outdated, less stringent air quality standard. Mr. Walke, you call this amnesty. What is the practical effect of allowing a new facility to be permitted under an outdated standard?
Well, the practical effect is the facility will emit pollution at levels that we know to be unhealthy. That previously, under 37 years of law, we had required them not to emit at in order to protect the public. And Mr. O'Mara and his colleagues across the country will be left explaining to concerned members of the public that Congress forced him and his colleagues to allow a facility to pollute at unhealthy levels that he cannot assure them are protective of air quality where they live.
So permitting authority might have to issue a permit for a higher polluting facility. Mr. Walk, what are the public health implications of exempting new or modified facilities from more protective air quality standards?
The Clean Air Act since 1970 has required national health standards that are adequate to protect public health with a requisite to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. The safety margin primarily to protect children, seniors, asthmatics, and other vulnerable parts of the population. This bill wipes away those safeguards and says we're going to allow this facility to pollute at levels that are not necessary to protect the public with that adequate margin of safety, and it will allow excessive and unhealthy levels of pollution that the law currently does not allow. We should be very clear about that.
And Secretary O'Mara, what impact could this have on states like Delaware that are downwind from polluting sources?
Right now, we are working using every vehicle in our disposal to both reduce emissions in state, and we've reduced emissions more than any other state in the country over the last 5 years, but also trying to get more reductions upwind. By having facilities that could cost effectively have fewer emissions and not capturing them at that point, you're either going to have to find ways to reduce it in other places, which would be more expensive, or we just have to suffer worse and worse health outcomes. Either outcome is bad for the economy and bad for the environment.
So the bill shifts the burden of air quality improvements from new plants to existing ones, existing facilities. Doesn't that raise the cost? If trying to retrofit an existing, isn't it more reasonable to say it would be less expensive if a new facility, it's coming online, it's going to be around for a longer period of time, should bear the cost of producing the emission reductions?
I mean, study after study shows that it's much more cost-effective to integrate design, pollution controls, and system designs to meet new standards as you're building a facility, as it is compared to retrofitting it. And so the idea of going back to a paint shop to make up for emission reductions because the big facility could have gotten 30% fewer emissions, but they didn't make the investments, and it's going to cost 50 times as much for the small guy, is really going to, I would argue, hurt manufacturing on net more than the avoided controls will help it.
So we raise the overall cost of pollution controls, and we harm public health at the same time. That doesn't sound like a very good deal to me. The existing industrial sources in your state, particularly if a new facility pushes an area into violation of the Clean Air Act, would be not just more expensive, but that would trigger a lot of other consequences as well. Would that be fair and cost effective?
Neither fair nor cost effective.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, this goes against the key principle of the Clean Air Act, which requires new sources to do more because they'll be around longer. It's a lot more cost effective to put in pollution controls up front. And if we step back and recognize the Clean Air Act works, it protects public health, it holds polluters responsible, fosters a state-federal partnership, and produces cost-effective pollution control, as far as I can tell, this bill would do none of those things. Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm working under the premise of what I've read coming into this hearing, that some of these delays can be anywhere from a third to 40% of these pre-construction or other EPA permits can be delayed for over a year. I know of one example out on the West Coast in Bellingham, Washington. They've been 4 years trying to get a permit to export coal. 4 years. 4 years. Mr. Walk, in your adult life, have you ever been unemployed?
No, sir.
I'm afraid too many people in the Beltway don't understand what that must feel like when they're trying to raise your 2-year-old child, and you've lost your job, and you're told they're going to build this other plant, or there's a hope for something to happen but it keeps getting delayed time and time and time again. I just, when do we become more caring as a nation to find out how we can move these projects forward? People want to build construction, or they want to build these manufacturing plants. The president has said he wants to do that. You say in your testimony that you would like to see that. But you seem to be putting perfect in front of just the good with this legislation. We're trying to make something happen, and we see government constantly standing in the way. It's a dangerous thing that I've noticed here. I've only been in Congress for 4 years, but I see a well-meaning people come to these panels, and their true intent is to stop legislation. And they do very clever with their words, how they twist them around, but the bottom line is not to let something happen. And all the while, there are people in West Virginia and Illinois and Indiana and Iowa, they're looking for jobs. They need manufacturing to come back to America. And people like you stand in the way because you want perfect to be the enemy of good. And so I'm asking, what would you do to expedite these permits so that there's no reason? You and I both know it. I'm an engineer. I've designed a lot of manufacturing plants. I've seen the delays on that. Why should they take over a year to get a pre-construction permit?
Mr. McKinley, if I may, you've chosen to spend a lot of your time talking about me, and I do care. I am here giving my time as a citizen and a
Would
witness.
you just please answer the question,
because
that's the way you come across to me.
we
That's
have
my
a
impression. So
public
tell me,
policy disagreement that there's no
going to
need
get
to
this
make
thing? Are
personal.
people working across America again? That's my question. Just how are you going to help us do it?
I think I've answered the question that I'm willing to answer for you, Mr. McKinley, after your remarks. Thank you.
Well, apparently you don't want to. You don't choose to help us out. We're trying to find a solution, and you seem to be putting up roadblocks.
I am here to help, Mr.
I'm
McKinley.
sorry that Mr. O'Mara, would you find ways that you might be able to find that you could help us expedite some of these and find some solutions?
Yeah, I think we've done a lot of work with value stream mapping, figuring out where the dead spots were in the timing of the permits. We issue our permits about 4 months, 4 to 6 months on average in Delaware, which is significantly less than the year minimum that's required in the law. We have better communication, more transparency. We fund our programs probably a little better than some other states, and we have a lot more collaboration with industry. And so, I think those are all things. And the other thing that we've worked on, a lot of the plants are looking for access to natural gas, and they can't figure out a way always to get access because a lot of times they have to bear the entire burden of the cost of getting the gas pipeline to their facility. We've actually helped with the cost of that in many cases to make the economics better for some of these manufacturing plants. But we have a range of things in Delaware we'd love to share with. I know Randy pretty well in West Virginia, my counterpart. They're doing some good things in West Virginia on the permitting side too. But there's a lot of these conversations going on among state regulators, and there are things that we can do to move things a lot faster.
In this time, my concern here, again, as you heard from my opening remarks, there are a lot of people unemployed. They're struggling out there. And I want to find ways that we can show more caring and compassion to help them out. How can we move that along? We have the resources. It's a matter of prioritizing the time within the EPA or wherever it is to make those things happen. And when you with your 2-year-old child and someone else with a 2 or 4 or 6-year-old child, they just want a job. Exactly. And when they hear someone holding up a permit because of a technicality, I find that offensive, and it's not good for the welfare of this country. So I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the witnesses for their testimony is a good spectrum of opinions that came across this morning. I do want to say that I disagree with some of my colleagues' statements that the EPA's total purpose is to prevent projects from going in, or that's not realistic. That's fairly biased. So we'll move on from that. But when you hear, from our point of view, when you hear testimony, you hear very contradictory ideas regarding uncertainty. Does this proposed bill, increase uncertainty, or does it increase certainty? Does it increase state agency burdens, or does it decrease state agency burdens? Does it improve air quality, or does it decrease air quality? Those are the things I'd like to understand about this bill. So I know that these have come up already in some of the questions, but I'd like to start with increasing of the certainty or decreasing of the certainty that this bill would provide. And I'd like to start with Ms. Kerrigan. Would you give an opinion about whether this would increase or decrease uncertainty in the permitting process for manufacturers?
Sure. I think it would increase and improve certainty. The transparency aspect, of the legislation in terms of the posting of the information about the permits, the percentage of the permits, the timing of the permits, public measurement of that, those type of things tends to improve performance.
How about legal challenges? Would that would legal challenges be enhanced or diminished?
I'm not quite sure. That assumes that the EPA, as I read this law, is not doing its job, or wouldn't do its job under this legislation, that it wouldn't be doing the concurrent guidance and the rules along with enacts. So, if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, then this stuff, some of the unintended consequences, legal challenges and things like that may occur.
Mr. Welke?
Well, as I've testified, I believe the bill probably unintentionally creates greater legal uncertainty and vulnerabilities for both the facility that's receiving the amnesty under Section 3B, as well as other local businesses that, as Mr. O'Mara has testified, are now going to be facing greater and more costlier obligations to retrofit and to make up for that shortfall. I don't think you meant this use of the term uncertainty, but I think the bill does create the certainty that unhealthy emission levels will increase in the area, and the certainty that local communities will be subjected to unhealthy air pollution. It's just an inescapable result of the amnesty.
Which would increase legal problems for the manufacturers.
Well, I suspect that there may be some unhappy citizens and groups in those communities that do not wish unhealthy air pollution levels to increase, and the bill creates, legal uncertainties and vulnerabilities for such lawsuits, not only created by the bill, but in the background law that allows citizens to hold government accountable when they don't uphold the law.
Well, thank you. Mr. O'Mara, would promoting new Manufacturing Act place a large burden on states, or would it reduce the burden on states?
It increases the burden. It increases it in two major ways. One is that the regulatory uncertainty of having to permit facilities under an old standard, knowing that you're going to need to ask other facilities, existing facilities, to make up for their shortfall to meet your state goals is a challenge. And then some of the reporting challenges, folks, if they were feeding information to EPA rather than delivering permits, that could slow down the permits as well.
Does anyone on the panel believe that the bill would improve air quality?
I don't believe that this bill's intention is to improve or degrade air quality one way or the other. It's just to make the permits happen faster. I mean, none of my members, no manufacturer wants to pollute more, right? I mean, so
clearly, but
we just want to make sure that we don't.
If you live in an unattainment region, you certainly don't want to see things get worse, and I have a fear that this would make things worse. Last question, Mr. O'Mara, do you have specific recommendations that would improve the permitting process that you'd like to share, perhaps in a written version later on?
Absolutely. We'd be happy to share our examples.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair and welcome all the witnesses. The people back home in Texas 22 want clean air and clean water. And they know that we've made great strides in improving our environment. Of course, these protections have come at a cost. But if we go too far, if we allow regulations to become red tape with little benefits, we block economic opportunity. We kill jobs. Sometimes I think EPA forgets that poverty is a threat to public health too. Rules show that economic expansion hurts the most impoverished in Texas. Slow economic expansion hurts the most impoverished in Texas. And that's why bills like this one before us are so useful. As Mr. Eisberg testified, we'll see a new ozone rule. It will likely be among the most expensive regulation in our country's history. EPA's estimate of a 10-year, $1 trillion drag on our economy could be the low end. That doesn't make for a Merry Christmas. Every state will see tough new permitting requirements. Creating jobs will be harder. With that in mind, it's not unreasonable to demand transparency and fairness on new source review. We need to get this right and strike the right balance before it gets worse. We have almost 10 million unemployed people in this country. I wonder what they would give to have a plant or a job in their hometown. My first questions are for Ms. Gerstmann and Mr. Eisenberg. Recently, EPA has failed to release updated guidance after it published new NAAQS standards. We're giving people a target, but leaving them in the dark as to how to get there. That's unfair. It brings uncertainty at a time when NAM and ACC members are making multi-billion-dollar investments decisions. How important is good understanding of timing when a major project is online? How important is that? Ms. Gershman?
You're really hitting the nail on the head, and I want to emphasize that, you know, the facilities that we're building are state of the art. They have pollution controls. Nothing in this legislation is doing anything to undermine the NAAQS and the permitting process itself. These facilities will already have to install the best available control technology or ensure that it has the lowest achievable emission rate. None of that's being changed. What we are simply here to ask is for EPA to make sure that it's thought through some of the implementation challenges that come about with these lower standards. That's what we're asking. EPA is still working to implement some of these standards that they've put in place with the unintended consequences of not having the models available or not having monitoring available to make the designations. Areas that are in limbo between standards do not necessarily know how to proceed. This holds up permits. A lot of these projects come with a substantial amount of financing attached. This financing is not available indefinitely. And if these permits aren't issued, there are times where the financing will disappear and the projects will therefore not go forward. And that's really what we're trying to do here.
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Eisenberg, you as well, sir.
Thank you. I think Ms. Gershman summed it up quite well. We wouldn't be talking about this if it hadn't become a problem already. And it's a problem that we just want solved. You saw in my written testimony the list of issues that my members have. There was really very little editing on my part in that list. I mean, I just said, hey, guys, can you send me what you think? And I just put it in there. And they have a lot of problems. I don't think that they're under the illusion that this is ever going to be perfect. They just want it to not be impossible. Yep. And it's at a point where it's impossible.
And one final question for all the panelists. If EPA releases new air quality standards, do you believe that the agency should always issue implementing rules and guidance in a concurrent or timely fashion? Yes or no? Ms. Gershman? Yes. Mr. Weiss? Mr. Amaro?
Yes, but we shouldn't stop the permits if they don't.
Mr. Waukee?
As warranted.
Yes.
And finally, Mr. Eisenberg?
Yes.
One final question, Mr. Eisenberg, about ozone. These new rules will put most of our country in non-attainment. Doesn't that make sense to make this step right and make it more important that this permitting process is correct?
So you raise a very interesting issue. I put some graphics in my testimony where we literally mapped out all of the projects that are now on the slate for because of this new energy resource, and they all fall in areas that would presumably be a non-attainment at 60, which is the low end of what EPA is considering. We're extremely concerned about this, and so at a minimum, we need the permitting fixed on the back end, so that if we get hit hard on the front end, we at least have a way forward.
I'm out of time to get back. By the way, sir, 5 national parks and forests will be attainment with this 0.6 parts per billion standard. 5.
Thanks for your enthusiasm, Mr. Olson. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome witnesses, and let me thank you all for sharing your thoughts with this committee. I do find it regrettable, though, if your personal integrity is challenged or when your thoughts are offered and we put you down for that. We all support efficient and effective permitting that protects public health and our environment without unnecessary delays. But this bill won't accomplish that goal, in my opinion. Rather than helping state agencies process permits or helping EPA support states, the bill actually distracts the very people tasked with writing the permits and implementing the law. The bill requires EPA to publish data on permit processing times, but EPA doesn't have this information because states, not EPA, issue almost all of the permits. My understanding is that states voluntarily provide some information, but to get all of the information required by the bill, EPA is going to have to put new reporting requirements upon states. Secretary O'Mara, do you think EPA publishing data on permitting times will help Delaware issue pre-construction permits more quickly?
No, because I think at the end of the day, having the local government, the local entity, whether it's a local air quality management district or a state, in our case, having that information delivered at the local level so it's more transparent is actually a better use of time. So there's more accountability locally than at the national level.
Thank you. And would it be a distraction for your permitting staff if they have to collect information for EPA?
Yeah, well, every minute they're spending on that is a minute they're not issuing a permit.
Thank you. The bill also requires EPA to report to Congress every year about the agency's efforts to expedite pre-construction permitting. Again, since states are the primary permit writers, it is unclear how EPA will be able to explain or commit to resolve any permitting delays. Secretary O'Mara, would this report to Congress help Delaware expedite its pre-construction permitting?
No.
Well, the core of this bill requires EPA to issue guidance and rules concurrently with any new or revised air quality standard. Putting aside whether or not this is a workable or useful requirement, one thing is clear. It would require EPA to do still more work on a shorter timeline. Mr. Walk, what do you think? Do you think this bill's reporting requirements will make it easier or harder for EPA to issue guidance and rules more quickly?
I think it will make it harder.
And this committee wants EPA to do more information collection and publication, more actions to expedite state permits, and more reports to Congress, more and faster rules and guidance for every revised air quality standard. Common sense dictates that this would require more people and more resources, but the bill fails to provide the agency with any new funding. In fact, my Republican colleagues have voted time and time again to slash the EPA's budget. Mr. Walk, how have budgeted cuts affected EPA's ability to implement clean air programs?
We have actual evidence that EPA itself has told federal courts and has certainly told stakeholders that they lack the necessary budget resources today to fully carry out the law. And my written testimony has just an example of that occurred in a court case, I think, about 2 weeks ago.
Unfortunately, EPA is not here today to tell us how this bill would affect the agency's ability to issue timely guidance and rules while satisfying this bill's reporting requirements. I hope we will have a chance to hear from EPA before marking up this bill. Secretary O'Mara, I'll ask you this as the lone government official on this panel. Would you rather have EPA focus its limited resources on implementing air quality standards and providing technical assistance to states, or on collecting data and reporting to Congress?
We will take any help we can get to have them help us issue permits more quickly.
And thank you. If my Republican colleagues are actually interested in making permitting faster and more efficient, then they should start by ensuring that EPA and state agencies have the resources they need to implement the law. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back at this time. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Mr. Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy. Actually, he's not Mr. Louisiana, he's Mr. Cassidy from Louisiana, for 5 minutes. I was all set to call on Mr. Griffith, and then you okay. Mr. Griffith, you're
all right.
Next on 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Mr. Eisenberg, you were asked earlier if you thought that this bill improved air quality, and you said you weren't sure that that was the purpose of the bill, but I would submit to you that it may be part of the purpose of the bill. It may not have been the primary purpose of the bill. And here's the reasoning. I think Mr. Scalise hit on it earlier, that I think that this does actually work to improve air quality. You indicated in your prior testimony that while nobody wanted to be named, that you had members of your organization who had not opened up facilities or had stopped working on a project because of the length of time and the fact that they weren't certain what was going to happen with the permitting process through the EPA because of the length of time and the uncertainties caused by the current system. And what we know is, according to a NASA study, it takes 10 days for the air to get from the middle of the Gobi Desert to the eastern shore of Virginia. And when you're talking about air, we all share the same air. So either that company chooses for regulatory purposes to open up their facility in another country, which doesn't have the standards that we have, or they choose to let their competitors in another country produce the product that they could have produced in the United States, creating jobs for American citizens. And at the same time, those countries don't have the regulations that we have in existence in our country, and the delay in the regulatory process thus means that that product, whether it's a styrofoam cup or some big piece of equipment, is going to be made in some other country as opposed to being made in the United States. Thus, we have damaged the air of the world, particularly the air in the Northern Hemisphere, if it goes into the Northern Hemisphere, which then directly impacts the air quality in the United States. With that reasoning in line, wouldn't you agree then that this bill, by making the process easier and encouraging manufacturing in the United States where we do care about our air quality, actually does improve air quality? Would you agree with me on that?
I would, and thank you for pointing that out. And frankly, if EPA does the job that Congress would be requiring in this bill, then the permits are issued quickly and done at the levels that the statute would require. And so, yeah, it would absolutely improve air quality.
Yeah. And I think that everyone would agree, and Ms. Gershman, if I understood your testimony earlier, your folks are doing the best that they can with the state-of-the-art technology. They don't want to be out here dumping things into the air. They're trying to do the state-of-the-art, what is currently available, and they just need to know what the regulations are going to be, and it's that uncertainty which leads them to have frustration and maybe even as well look at perhaps using another country or allowing a competitor to produce the product. Is that also true?
Yes, that's correct. We're already doing the state of the art. We're taking the best available technologies and installing them on our new facilities.
And whenever there are delays, that can also create costs which don't help us create new jobs. It creates a negative impact on jobs.
Absolutely.
So, and I don't know who might want to touch on this, maybe Mr. Eisenberg, because I was talking with some people this morning, and we went back to my old Boiler Act bill that I had in a few years back, and they were lamenting particularly the timelines not having been passed because of the uncertainty. Just like this bill, that bill tried to deal with some of the uncertainties, and they were talking about the fact that regulations came out in 2004, and a lot of companies started, because they had a short time period, they started implementing and spent millions and millions of dollars complying with the 2004 regs. Then those got overturned in court, and the EPA had to come up with new regs, and now they're spending millions and millions of dollars to do things. And we heard testimony about that even from universities, not just always manufacturers that get hit by this, but the universities got hit by this. They spent the money to comply, then found out they weren't in compliance, and that creates a problem as well, does it not?
It absolutely does.
And so what we're trying to do here is there's a balance, and I appreciate Mr. O'Mara working with us on that balance, and all of you all trying to find that balance. We all want clean air. We all want clean water. What we have to do is try to figure out a way that we can have some certainty for those people who are creating the jobs, and at the same time make sure that we're moving forward to make our country the best that it can be. But that does not mean that we have to destroy jobs in the process. Wouldn't you agree with that, Mr. Weiss? And I do appreciate it. Thank you all so much for being here today and for your testimony today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Cassidy, you're up next. Or do you prefer that I go to Mr. Terry?
Go to Mr. Terry.
Okay, I'll recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Louisiana. I appreciate that. A little bit of a mild rant here first, just to kind of set the stage why I do think we need to be more specific in timelines. Just some of my personal experiences with people in my district. For example, a family-owned business called Magnolia Steel employs about 50 people out just a few miles outside of Omaha, but the family lives in my district. They wanted to expand. They were adding about 20 people, but they had to extend the building and have, since they pour molten steel into parts that are being used in machinery, It took them 2 years and $2 million. The addition to the building was a $1 million project. So they actually spent more in compliance costs than they did for the actual structure. So I hear stories about that and the fact that it took 2 years. And I think that's a broken process, especially on a small. We're not talking a Toyota facility. We're talking about a metal shed, basically. And then another Omaha business that has another one in Ohio, it's a metal fabrication business, spent a similar amount of time working with the feds, the EPA again on this one, took a long time. And it goes to the issue of then once they got all of the EPA and federal permitting and spent all the money for that, the state of Ohio, this plant happened to be in Ohio. They have one in Omaha as well. And the state came in and said, yeah, but our rules are different, and you have to do things differently. So now we have this conflict between state and federal. And both of those owners told me that of their extreme frustration. And that's the basis of here, of trying to figure out a way to streamline this, to reduce the cost of permitting. Because the guy from that makes the steel parts, the first one I talked about, literally said, I was on the verge of just shutting everything down and just moving the plant to Mexico. That doesn't benefit anybody. So I think it is in everyone's best interests that we figure out a better way to streamline this. And then there's just a couple of, when we talk about, Mr. Walk, some of us are very skeptical about the EPA. And I had a personal issue, and they had a new copper level for the state of Nebraska that was actually proposed to be lower than the natural copper levels in our water. And when I asked them directly, where's the science behind it, they said, well, we're just making assumptions due to our modeling, but I'll get you that, meaning they didn't have it. And then, lo and behold, about a year later, they came up with a study that said they were right. I love it when they make the numbers first and then back it up with the science later. It leaves me a little skeptical. And then we can get into the modeling on health and the fact that they say they're going to have, if this coal-fired plant reduces mercury emissions, but yet there hasn't been one incidence of high blood level of mercury in the citizens that were around that plant for 30 years. So sometimes we have to question, and that is our role. So with that, one of the things that I hear from, and I'm going to ask Mr. Weiss this, or Weiss, because no one has asked you a question since I've been here.
I was hoping just to stay here.
Very little. You seemed lonely over there. So part of this is that time period that we've discussed where there's maybe a change in the air quality standard. That's changed. They adapt to the new technology or try to, but the guidance from the EPA seems to be non-existent or slow. And I think that's probably the issue what Magnolia Steel was caught up in, and why it took 2 years is to get the guidance on how they actually comply. Do you see that as part of the problem here, is the guidance aspect of it, and is there what's the best way to reduce that?
I do. From a permitting engineer's viewpoint, which is what I do for a living, what I'd like to know is, what do you want me to do to make the demonstration? And right now, in a lot of cases, that guidance doesn't exist, and I use the fine particle standard as an example. I actually don't know how to make the demonstration that EPA wants often, and I issue more permits or do a lot more permitting work than a lot of people, and I don't know how to do it. And that causes delays on two levels. One, it causes delays prior to even filing the application, because we have to go meet with permitting authorities and try and understand what they want. And not all state agencies are as good as Delaware. They don't really know what they need, and that's a big issue, because you go meet and say, how do you want to do this? We don't know. Even when the states issue the permits, they follow EPA guidance. So the states need EPA guidance as much as the regulated community, and it doesn't exist. And I'm sure that's caused delays, because I have projects that I'm working on where that has caused delays prior to filing the application. We then file an application, and the comment is, Well, that analysis is not good enough. Well, what's good enough? Well, we don't know. We'll know when we see it. Okay, that's a problem. Okay, and that is a real problem in the process. So the rule, the way I read the Act, is let's get the guidance out. What do you want us to do? And let's not weaken air quality standards. Let's get the guidance out so the permitting community knows what we need to get done. And that would improve the process.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize Mr. Cassidy from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I've been running up and down. So if I'm asking you redundant questions, it's just because I've been running up and down. And just to give a context, the context we all know, clearly we have a problem with job growth for working class, middle class America. And they've traditionally been employed in mining, manufacturing, and construction, which shale gas and upstream, downstream creates an incredible number of good jobs and good benefits in mining, manufacturing, and construction. But what I'm hearing is that we've met the enemy, and he is the EPA. That now, I gather, Mr. O'Meara, you're not sure about this bill, but what did I read? That as I was obviously quickly scanning, that the EPA in 2011, when it said it was going to cover greenhouse gases, forecasted it would need to issue 900 new pre-construction permits per year, but in the 3+, only 166 have been done in total. This is you, Mr. Eisenberg. How many jobs would, and we have all these plans that would be for new projected plants. Can you give an estimate of how many jobs would have been created had there been 900 issued?
Frankly, I don't know that I can. The real issue there, and I really am just curious about why this is happening. I did have a member that said, well, we got our permit pretty quickly. I don't know that we fall into that, and we just permit a facility. I said, and then he went back and he looked, and he said, oh, well, we figured out a way not to trigger PSD. So what's happening, what could be happening, is that folks are building smaller projects that don't trigger things at that threshold. Is that a good thing? I honestly don't know the answer to that either. I mean, I don't think it is. I think if we have laws that are stopping us from going big and from building big things, that's a problem too.
So assuming that there's economy of scales in some of these projects, and we're competing globally, and I regularly hear that China, with their lax environmental standards, are building just to build, to employ people, putting us at a competitive disadvantage. Losing that economy of scale might hurt our workers, correct?
That's correct.
Oh, that's remarkable. And Ms. Gershman, I gather that you, in turn, are aware of these projects. Again, do you have any estimate of how many jobs are on hold because of the lack of certainty and timeliness as regards approval?
We have heard from some members that every day that the permit is not approved after that year timeline, that it can cost up to $5 million a day. And that's because a lot of these facilities have already gone out and they've secured all of the construction folks. And they've gone out and they've created job creation programs for folks in the community to be the operators and the pipe fitters and the electricians and all of the support staff that goes into running these huge complex facilities. And all of that is on hold while permits continue to be hammered out. And that's something that they want to move forward. They're committed to it. And yet they can't go ahead and hire those folks until they have work for these folks to do.
Now, what I know intuitively is that if we want to improve wages for folks and we create a lot of competition for construction workers, their wages are going up.
That is correct.
It is just because if you need a top-flight welder,
that's right,
she's going to be able to bid her services, frankly.
Exactly. And if there's no projects going forward, she will be waiting to get those services bid on.
Now, Ms. Kerrigan, I sponsored a bill called the Energy Consumers Relief Act, which was just focused upon. We had somebody from the EPA the other day making a comment, and I'm sure he regrets making it, that their economic projections are often flawed and unreliable. Well, thanks a lot. We've been banking on them for some time. And our whole point of my transparency, Consumer Relief Act, was to bring transparency to these major rules. Knowing that, let me just ask, knowing that others have asked it, if all you did was bring transparency, okay, this is what you have to go on what Mr. Weiss said. I say Weiss, not Weiss. I apologize if I... Weiss. Seymour Weiss assassinated Huey P. Long, which happens to be how I'm so familiar with the name, but as long as I'm Mr. Louisiana. So it looks as if there is transparency. That in itself would allow companies, you imply, companies to to plot out, well, we know it's actually not going to take a year, it'll take 18 months, and so therefore we can do all our permitting in light of the expanded timeline, something like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I agree with that. And again, if you have more transparency, and particularly the elements that are addressed in this bill, I think that will improve in performance in terms of expediting, the permits, and then that creates uncertainty. It creates certainty, for businesses and investors.
And jobs for working Americans.
Absolutely.
Mr. Weiss, and I was just intrigued. You do all this work, and yet you sometimes don't really know how EPA is progressing?
I don't know how EPA wants us to do the analysis.
That blows my mind. I mean, because
mine too. So
yeah, it seems fairly straightforward that if you're going to say, okay, we're going to have these many shale, related mining opportunities or plants related using natural gas as a feedstock, that you should be able to say in a spreadsheet, we give you this, we give you this, we give you this, and here are the variables we'll define later. But I gather there's nothing such as that.
Right. Your amazement is the same as my clients.
So again, when it comes to job creation for the working Americans who are having the hardest time, we've met the enemy, and it sounds like the enemy could be the EPA. I yield back, and thank you.
Well, Mr. Cassidy's touched on this. A number of members have touched on it. Mr. Weiss touched on it. And the crux of the issue is that specific point. A new standard is decided on at EPA, and EPA has been very aggressive. And then the guidance does not come out for some time later, sometimes years later. And so you're sitting there wondering about the modeling, wondering about the emissions. The guidance document is extremely technical, and so no one has the guidance that they need. And that's the crux of the issue. So, I mean, is it unreasonable to request EPA to come forth with the guidance when they come forth with the new standard, or is that something that is impossible to do? Would you all make a brief comment on that for me? I mean, what's the big issue about trying to do that?
I mean, that's certainly how we look at it. I don't see this as being unreasonable at all. We would hope that EPA would put it out in a timely fashion, and we would hope that there's a way to get it.
But it must be some practical reason that they don't do it. What is the? Do you have an idea, Ms. Kerrigan?
I have no idea. I mean, we'd love to hear, and I'm sure you would, from the EPA on this. It seems like it's something that can be done. They're good at regulating, and this is what.
But that's what Mr. Terry and others were talking about. These manufacturers are people who want to invest, and even the states lack the guidance, and so the uncertainty's there, and you're worried about the lawsuits, you're worried about spending the money. And Mr. O'Mara, do you have any thoughts, or Mr. Walker?
Well, it unfortunately takes a lot of time and resources to adopt these implementation rules and guidance, and you can look at the history of the program from the Reagan administration and Bush. It's not a partisan issue. It's a matter of just pure kind of the amount of time it takes. One thing I want to mention that hasn't been mentioned yet today is much of the implementation rules and guidance that eventually come out from EPA don't have anything to do with permitting at all. So there's a little bit of a disconnect in the bill. The bill's written kind of overly broadly to say if EPA fails to issue all or any implementation rules or guidance, we're going to allow permitting to proceed in violation of a newly revised standard. So there's a disconnect that kind of augments this unintended consequences that we've been talking about. But I think the simple answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, is it takes a lot of time and involves a lot of consultation. There is complexity. The question is, who bears the burden of that? Should the public suffer, heavier polluted air, or is there another solution to a valid problem?
Yeah, Mr. O'Mara.
Thank you. There's two different ways to look at the lack of guidance at the beginning. I mean, there's the way that Delaware's approached it, where we're going to go full steam ahead. We're not going to wait for it. We're going to, be very clear with industry. We're going to be, very consult closely with EPA, but we're not going to wait for them. And there are other places that will ask for guidance all the time and kind of have this paralysis where they won't issue permits until the guidance is issued. And I think you've heard some of those nightmare stories. I mean, I'd like to actually see some additional either guidance or not guidance, use a different word, some additional direction to the states to move ahead. There's no reason to wait for EPA guidance, and states that do that in good faith with some kind of reasonableness to the adherence to the NAC standard should have some kind of sovereignty or some kind of deference in that decision-making process in the interim period. I mean, a process like that would actually achieve air quality goals and give the manufacturers at this table more certainty, and the state regulators that have the capacity can work with folks one-on-one instead of decisions coming out of D.C.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's some area of potential commonality, because what we don't want is you don't want states to feel paralyzed where they don't feel like they can go with a permit, and also having these other adverse impacts.
Right. Mr. Weiss, you have any comment?
Thank you. The process of adopting a national ambient air quality standard is also a long and consultative and time-consuming process, and I really don't understand why the guidance can't be worked on simultaneously during that process. They know the standard's coming. In the case of fine particles, they knew that precursor emissions were going to be a big issue in the fine particle standard, and really we should have a way of analyzing precursor emissions because they're a major contributor, and that all could have been worked on during the adoption of the ambient air quality standard. One shouldn't forget that.
Ms. Gershman, you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Weiss. I think really what we're trying to get at here is to require EPA to give a little more thought through the entire NAC setting process as to what happens after that NAC's number is put out there. Okay. And that's really, we're just looking for some certainty as to what happens at that point.
Well, thank you. Mr. Rush, you probably recognize.
Mr. Chairman, I really, the question I have is not to the panelists, it's to you. Are you going to allow EPA to come before this subcommittee prior to a markup? I think that is very important that the EPA has be allowed to respond to some of the issues raised by members of this subcommittee and some of the panelists. And so on the question of unreasonableness, is my opinion that, and the question is whether or not it's unreasonable to allow the EPA to come before this subcommittee tomorrow, Thursday, next week, before we proceed to marking up this bill. The EPA needs to have an opportunity to respond. So is it your intention to allow the EPA an opportunity to come to testify before this subcommittee on this matter?
I don't know if we're going to have another hearing for EPA or not, but we are in discussions with EPA. They've indicated that they're willing to work with you, technical assistance. And I don't even know when we're looking at a markup, but, you know, I personally don't want to mark up a bill that's not going to have some genuine support. And so some of these suggestions about additional sovereignty for states and so forth so that they have more authority is something that I think has some merit, because I think all we're looking for is a little certainty. So, but we look forward to working with you as we move forward on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all, and that concludes today's hearing. I want to thank all of you for taking your time to come up and visit with us, and we appreciate your expertise and your thoughts on this important subject. We'll keep the record open for 10 days and for any additional materials that might need to be administered. And so that will conclude today's hearing. And by the way, our staffs may be in touch with some of you over the next few days or weeks as we try to see if there's ways we can improve this draft bill. So thank you very much. Hearing's adjourned.